Hey, welcome back. This week's topic is on public opinion and public opinion polls. So what we're going to focus on is, first of all, what is public opinion? Second, how is public opinion measured? And third, is this information reliable? Okay, so the first thing is, what is a public opinion? It's how people think or feel about a particular issue, candidate, or institution within a population. Okay, so that could be in, how people in Ohio feel about taxes, or how do people in Kentucky feel about LGBTQ rights? How do people in the West feel about the federal government's land management policy? That kind of stuff. Okay, so it's a survey, and then they qualify that in some data. It's not easy to measure because it changes quickly, and among locales, I should say. So, how people feel in California about an issue might be different than how people feel in North Dakota about an issue. Politicians call this what the people want. So politicians pay it, even though a lot of politicians say, I don't pay attention to public opinion polls. They're lying, they do. And these public opinion polls measure what the what the people want. For instance, if President Biden, he's about to sign a COVID relief bill, if the public opinion polls show that 85% of Americans are against this COVID relief bill, he probably wouldn't sign it. They do pay attention to public opinion because, honestly, if they're not doing what the public wants, they're not going to get reelected. Okay, it's measured by polls. Okay, now we're going to get into some polling terms here. If you've had statistics before, these are going to sound familiar. They use a random sampling, and what that means is that a small number of people are surveyed. Usually they do about 2,000 people. 1,000 to 2,000 people they survey to measure public opinion for the entire United States. Now you might think, how do they do that? There's 325 million Americans. How can they survey a couple thousand and get that result and say this is how Americans feel when it's only a couple of thousand? Well, they use a random sampling, and what that means is everybody has the same chance of getting selected. So they use computers for this today, and phone numbers, and they'll randomly dial people. And they also use demographics. For instance, if they want to find out how senior citizens feel about a certain issue, obviously they'll only contact people 65 and older. That's still a random sample because in the title of the poll it says how senior citizens feel about whatever issue. Okay? It's random, so it allows surveys to make inferences about the entire population. So if they're doing, how people over the age of 18 feel about the COVID relief bill, then it's going to include people from all demographics, all age groups, both men and women equally. And there's your random sample there. And it has a margin of error of plus or minus 3% per 1,000 surveyors. So if they survey 1,000 Ohioans and ask, how do you feel about Ohio's tax laws? And 53% say they are in favor of Ohio's tax laws. That actually could be anywhere from 56 at the high end, the plus or minus 3%, or down to 50%. So there is that margin of error. So there's a 6-point swing in one direction and the other, if it's a random sampling. They need to pose, the reasonable questions have to be posed, and they have to be worded fairly. Otherwise, they can influence the results. I've got an example down here of a question, and this is a biased question. Okay, it says taxpayers are. This would be somebody. Imagine somebody calling you on the phone and asking you this question. Taxpayers are paying billions in tax dollars to welfare, unemployment, public housing, bilingual education, and legal defense costs. The problem is becoming worse. Do you personally approve of having your tax dollars spent to support illegal aliens? How do you feel about that? Well, obviously, the stem of the question is going to greatly influence you because it's giving you information about the issue that they're surveying. Now, are we wasting billions in welfare, unemployment, and public housing, bilingual education? Well, no, because in order to receive welfare, from the United States government or the state government, you have to have a Social Security number. If you don't have a Social Security number, you can't get the welfare. Illegal immigrants don't have Social Security numbers. You can't collect unemployment if you're an undocumented alien because you don't have a Social Security number and so forth. Okay? Pollsters have to ask people about issues that the person being surveyed are informed. Okay? So they might ask a question ahead of time, about if it's about taxes, is the head of the household there, the person that pays the taxes when they make the phone call? That's okay. That's not being biased. That's just making sure that they're asking people information who are informed on the issue. You wouldn't want to ask a 6-year-old, hey, how do you feel about taxes? Because they don't pay any. Okay? Now, there are different types of polls. There's opinion polls. How do you feel about an issue? Okay, there's a benchmark poll. It's usually the first poll taken in election. During an election, they're testing the water. So about a year from now, they'll start talking about the 2024 presidential election. Well, at the beginning of that, they'll say, which candidates, they'll take polls and ask people which candidates they favor, and that's your benchmark, okay? So when they say something like, in the last 6 months, President Biden has lost 5%, or since the beginning of the campaign, President Biden has lost 6% of his support. Well, that's the current poll compared to the benchmark poll. There's tracking polls that trace opinion over time. So, they might say things like, since 2010, 62% of Americans are in favor of same-sex marriages. And that's an increase of 32%. I'm making these numbers up, but that would be, they use tracking polls for that. And then entrance and exit polls. Okay, I never really have heard on the news about an entrance poll, or I hear more about exit polls. So they ask voters, if they ask them before they go in the voting booth, what's important to you? That's an entrance poll. Once they vote and they ask them a question, that's the exit poll. So on election day, the news might report, well, most of the people that were coming from the polls that we surveyed said that the biggest issue to them is the economy. Okay, so that's based on exit polls. Okay, how can opinions differ? Okay, here's how you measure opinions: intensity, the degree to which people feel strongly about an issue. Okay, if you ask somebody about national park lands in Colorado versus the people in Ohio about these same Colorado public lands, the people of Colorado are going to be very more intense about that issue because they are more impacted by it. Just like my tax example before. If you ask, a 40-year-old about taxes versus somebody who is, and has a family versus somebody who's 16 and working their first job, their intensity about that issue might be less strong than the person who's 40 years old. If you just lost a job, you'll probably feel strongly about economic issues. That'll be your number one issue. Okay, there's something called opinion saliency. Some issues are more relevant to some than others. Okay, if somebody attends church services every Sunday, they're going to have a different set of beliefs and opinions, what matters most to them, than somebody who probably doesn't attend church every Sunday. Okay, we talked about student loan debt forgiveness. You probably have, when we talked about that last week in our Zoom meeting, that's something that you probably had some pretty intense feelings about. You had some saliency because that directly impacts you versus somebody, if you ask the same thing about somebody, who's 65, they're not going to have as strong of opinion as you. There's stability, the steadiness or volatility of an opinion on an issue. How much does that change over time? How much has this viewpoint changed over time? The issue that I've seen that has changed the quickest in my lifetime has been the issue of same-sex marriage. I remember 10 years before the Obergefell versus Hodges decision, which legalized same-sex marriage in the United States under the 14th Amendment by the United States Supreme Court, that, it was probably a majority of Americans were against same-sex marriage. But then as you got closer to that 2014 decision, more and more Americans, public opinion had changed. More and more Americans had become in favor of same-sex marriage. Okay? Now, these all change over time. To give you an example, what do you think the most pressing issue on October 29th, 1929, that's the day after the stock market crash and what's considered the beginning of the Great Depression, versus on October 28th? What was the biggest issue on December 8th, 1941? That's what the day after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, versus maybe December 6th, 1941, and then September 12th, 2001. What did Americans say? This is our most important issue, and it was probably trying to defeat terrorism. Whereas on September 10th, it probably was something else, the day before the terrorist attacks. Okay, now how do we get these opinions? Now this is something, this political socialization is something we're going to cover in an entire chapter in 2 weeks. So how do we get these opinions? Okay, it's called political socialization. And you get it through your family. Your family has a big impact on you, especially when you're younger. If you're religious or not, your religion has a big impact on your political beliefs. Your schooling. Okay, where did you go to school? What media do you watch? What is your racial background? Where did you work? What community did you grow up in? These all impact our political viewpoints and how we feel about certain things. Okay, well, like I said, we'll get into more in depth in a couple weeks in that. Now, let's look at some examples of some polls, okay? The gender gap. Here's some differences in political views of men and women. Now, this poll was done in 1996, so it's obviously out of date, but this shows the differences between men and women on some political issues. Okay? Sexual harassment is a very serious problem in the workplace. Men say 24%, women say 38%. Obviously, women are higher than that because they're the victims of sexual harassment. Okay, I consider myself a Democrat. 32% of men, 44% of women. We should, do things to help the homelessness. 51% to 63%. I think this is the biggest gap. We should ban all handguns except for the police. 33% of men say yes. 58% of women say no. I'm sorry, I had that the opposite. 30, so a majority of men say we shouldn't ban handguns, and a majority of women say we should. Differences between college students over time. Let's see. You could look at these issues, and basically the one I want to point out is that the amount of trust in government to solve our problems has gone down amongst college students. This is from the 1970s to 1993. Criminals have too many rights. 1970s, 52, 1993, 68%. So you can see these things. You have the same demographic, 18 to 22-year-olds. Those priorities and those feelings about those issues change over time. There's generation gaps. Okay, Social Security. Would you support or oppose a plan in which people who choose to invest some of their Social Security contributions in the stock market? What that means is you have more, your Social Security that's taken out of your check, instead of going to seniors, now you would be able to take some of that and put it in investments, so that will be around for you as you get older. You can see that the number of people that oppose it generally is higher as people get older, because, of course, that means that senior citizens wouldn't have as much Social Security to collect. But the support of that is highest amongst people aged 18 to 29, because they're not collecting Social Security. They're paying for the people 65 and older. So I think you could understand why their support of that is pretty heavy. So there definitely are generational gaps on issues. You can see that there is differences in your racial background, okay? African Americans who believe, the amount that believe the justice system is racially biased. 72% of African Americans, a big majority, versus 44% of a minority of whites, see that as an issue. Interracial marriages, you can see that's pretty similar. Willing to vote for a black person for president, that's pretty similar. Okay. All right, how liberals and conservatives differ on issues. Okay, that same idea that we should be allowed to invest some of our own Social Security money, higher amongst Republicans than Democrats. The death penalty should be allowed. 46% of Democrats, 55% of Republicans. They have an unfavorable opinion of the National Rifle Association. 44% of Democrats, 20% of Republicans. And you can see that these, obviously follow what Democrats and Republicans politically believe. Now, how does public opinion impact politics? Okay. Now, politicians say they don't pay attention to public opinion polls. They do, because it helps them figure out what the public believes. The media will do, or a polling organization will do the work for them. They get to see the results and then make judgments politically based on how they feel, if in the case of the president of the United States, how the nation feels, or if it's a senator, how their state feels, or if it's a representative, how the people in their district feel. Politicians can also create their own public opinion polls if they want to. And polls reflect the policy agenda, the problems that people inside and really outside of government believe must be addressed. So, if people are saying that we're not making enough money off of our jobs to cover our expenses, then a COVID relief bill, which includes stimulus checks to individuals, politicians might read that and say, wow, 85% of the public think that we should, again, I'm making these numbers up, should feel like we should pass this COVID relief bill. And it's going to be popular amongst Republicans and Democrats. But again, public opinion can change quickly. Okay? The image I have of President Bush, this was after the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, when the United States military invaded the country of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, a dictator, was overthrown within a matter of about 3 weeks. President Bush took a plane, a jet, landed on this aircraft carrier. It was really cool, I got to tell you. I watched it live on television. It was really cool. So he came out in a flight suit. He didn't fly the plane. He was a passenger. But then he changed into his suit and tie, his presidential attire, and gave a speech under this banner. I don't know if you can see it. It says, "Mission accomplished." So that told Americans that, hey, we've done our duty in Iraq. Okay? 72% approval of the invasion of Iraq at that time. A year later, it was 30%. Why? Because there was an insurgency. There was a civil war, basically, in Iraq because there was no government. There was a power vacuum. So groups tried to take power by force. The United States got caught in the middle of that. And so the approval rating, not only of President Bush, but also of the invasion of Iraq, went down by, about 2/3. Okay? Now, who has influence over public opinion? This is, the graph I have here has this follows what's at the top is the attentive public, the degree of how much people pay attention to politics is what I'm trying to say, is at the top. So the attentive public, they pay attention to the most. Part-time citizens are ones that pay attention to what's going on generally around election time. And then political know-nothings are people that just don't care about politics and don't even vote. So who has influence over that? 25% of poll takers are part of the attentive public. They have pretty strong feelings. 40% are part-time citizens, and then 35% are other political know-nothings. So if you take that into consideration and figure that out for the entire American public, about 25% of the people are paying attention to politics all the time. If you combine these two numbers, 75% are either paying attention to it only during election time or not at all. Now, my question for you guys is, this is a rhetorical question, can American democracy survive if people they just don't care? Okay, now how do these 25% of American public get involved? How do they do? They protest. We use, for the most part, minus the storming of the Capitol, in January of 2021, peaceful, nonviolent protests. Everybody has the right to do that under the First Amendment. In a lot of other countries, they use violence because they don't have the right to express themselves, whether it's through the media or just through public gatherings. So they do this by force. They use violence. The attentive public contributes to political action committees or individual campaigns of people running for office. They try to influence others. They discuss politics and they try to get people to their side. They work for candidates who are running for office. You know, they'll do the polling for them, and they'll go do door-to-door and do canvassing. Voting, and more people are doing this. Voter turnout has increased in the 21st century. And do they join a party? About a third of Americans, a third of voters belong to the Republican Party. About a third belong to the Democratic Party. More and more are independents. Sometimes they vote Republican, sometimes they vote Democrat. It depends on what the issue is. It depends on who's running. Remember the term candidate-centered politics. Okay? All right, so that's what you need to know, the basics for public opinion polls. Good luck on the assignments this week. If you have any questions, send me an email or come into office.